Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this panel. My name is Lindsay Jolivette. I am a PhD candidate in the East Asian Languages and Cultures Department at the University of Southern California. And today I will be presenting my paper, Disastrous Projections, Nuclear Futurity in South Korea's Pandora. On March 11th, 2011, the Daiichi nuclear power plant in Fukushima, Japan, suffered a series of disastrous events now known collectively as 3/11. An earthquake offshore in the Pacific Ocean shook the island and triggered a tsunami that hit the Tohoku region with unexpected force. As if the earthquake and tsunami were not devastating enough, these geological disasters also led to multiple meltdowns within the Fukushima Daiichi power plant. The repercussions of 3/11 on Japan's society and environment are innumerable, but the reverberations of the event also rippled out beyond Japan's borders and increased the overall sense of the disastrous future that faces nuclear nations in the rest of East Asia. In South Korea, henceforth referred to simply as Korea, both the proximity to Japan and the large number of domestic nuclear power plants is particularly concerning. Previously, Korea's comparative dearth of large earthquakes had made the threat of seismic catastrophe seem less than in Japan. But that veneer of safety was shattered by two earthquakes over 5.0 magnitude in July and September of 2016. The following December, the film Pandora that I will be discussing today was released. Pandora tells the story of a nuclear power plant meltdown in a coastal Korean town, and with a plot that closely mirrors the real-world events of 3/11, it is an uncomfortable look at the future potential for similar events to occur in Korea. In this presentation, I argue that Pandora is a nuclear disaster film of projected futurity that brings to the surface of Korean media consciousness uncanny ecological and political similarities to Japan's nuclear power plant disaster of 3/11. In Pandora, the mirrored situation of nuclear ecology in the two nations of Japan and Korea is highlighted by projection, cinematically, factually, and psychoanalytically, and these projections allow the monstrosity of the nuclear disaster to become thinkable and confrontable. The projection in Pandora is cinematic in the way it communicates a message about the future of nuclear ecology via a filmic medium, factual in its attentiveness to the mirroring of realistic geological and political conditions in Korea, and psychoanalytic in the way it makes visible not only collective fears of nuclear disaster, but also the sometimes repressed similarities between the situation of nuclear ecology in Korea and Japan. Instead of retelling a real domestic incident as a historical remembrance, Pandora reproduces the disaster of 3/11 in a domestic setting, thereby functioning as an actionable warning for the Korean nation in a way that nuclear disaster films focused on remembrance do not. It exposes patterns of catastrophic repetition that have not yet occurred, but which are constantly on the verge of occurring in Korea's own backyard. My framing of disastrous temporality and futurity in nuclear ecologies is primarily informed by the theorizations of Maurice Blanchot and Kenneth Kraft. Drawing on their theories, I posit that the film Pandora suggests a time-space in which disaster is inevitable, or in other words, always imminently present. This concept of disastrous temporality is discussed by Blanchot in his work The Writing of the Disaster, in which he says that the order of lived time belongs to the disaster, and further that there is no future that is not already permeated by the disaster. Blanchot was writing about his experiences with war, the Holocaust, and Hiroshima, but his understanding of the disaster as an entity in and of itself that exists perpetually in a temporal continuation is also applicable to the disasters that have come after his writing. Along with his negation of distinct time periods existing outside of the disaster, Blanchot's writing can also push us to think about the lack of truly distinct geological or environmental borders that often accompany disaster. Kraft says in Buddhism and Ecology that putting the words nuclear and ecology side by side may spur us to consider nuclear realities in a larger context that incorporates present and future effects on the biosphere, in a word, ecologically. Taken together, these two theories break down temporal and ecological borders between Korea and Japan and suggest that it is not a question of if, but rather a question of when another disaster similar to 3/11 will occur. Pandora, the film, takes place in Ulsan, Korea, as pictured here on the map, and it tells the story of a nuclear meltdown in the town's power plant after a major earthquake cracks the coolant system surrounding one of the reactors, as was the actual case in Fukushima on 3/11. What follows in the plot is a plethora of bad choices and mismanagement from the local and national governmental bodies, followed then by heroic sacrifices from the working class people to repair the reactor. The opening of the film makes clear that a discussion of nuclear safety and the role nuclear power plays in society was an intended element of the film. In the first shot of Pandora, 5 children stand on a jetty looking across a small channel of water to the massive nuclear power plant in the background, as can be seen in this picture here. One of the children turns to the other 4 and asks them if they know what the power plant has inside. Although the first child claims it houses a robot, a second child refutes him and says that it houses a rice cooker. The metaphor of the rice cooker, which he has been told by his older brother who works in the plant, hints at the developmental policies championed by the government-run nuclear power company, which wanted Korean people to view them as a life-sustaining necessity. The young boy continues, saying, "Because of that rice cooker, we can enjoy life." However, both boys are refuted by the one girl in their group, who states confidently that her teacher said the plant is like a box, and that if it were ever opened, evil would come out. Upon her ominous proclamation, the screen fades to black, and the title of the film, Pandora, appears. Each child that speaks hints at a different role nuclear energy plays in the socio-cultural context of Korea. 1, the futuristic advanced technology; 2, the society-sustaining energy source built for human comfort; and 3, the dangerous, uncontrollable entity that desperately needs to be contained for the safety of all. Although the Greek myth of Pandora's box is not directly mentioned again after this scene, opening with a reference to it communicates clearly that the naming of the film was done intentionally to discuss the conflicting opinions about nuclear power and its place in society. Ultimately, it is the little girl in the film's opening that has the right of it. The moment the nuclear box is opened, something monstrous spills out. The primary plot of the film takes place years later and follows the town's people whose entire lives have become hinged on the existence of the nuclear power plant. The main character is a young man named Jae-hyuk who works in the power plant. He can be seen pictured here in the tracksuit with white stripes. Among his friend group, all of whom also work at the plant, Jae-hyuk is the only one that shows active resentment towards their way of life. According to him, the plant is to blame for the extinction of the local fishing industry and for the lack of tourist economy. While having beers together after work, Jae-hyuk says to his friends, "Are you happy living like this?" implying that a life completely reliant on the power plant is hardly fulfilling. To his disappointment, his friends respond that they don't need to be happy, they simply need to live. Unfortunately, living itself is something disaster narratives bring into question. Throughout the film, Jae-hyuk reiterates that the town has no future, which suggests that he, at least, is aware of the way residing in a nuclear ecology has robbed them all of a disaster-free life. Due to the power plant's seemingly inescapable influence in the town, Pandora's futurity is inevitably catastrophic, and there is a sense that the lived time of every person residing in Ulsan belongs to the disaster, or at least belongs to the nuclear power plant. Blanchot says of living in such a disaster temporality, "We are on the edge of disaster without being able to situate it in the future. It is rather always already past, and yet we are on the edge or under the threat." In other words, the disaster is its imminence. Although the disaster portrayed in Pandora has not happened in Korea, there is a sense of the inevitability about its coming. As a film, Pandora is not only a projection onto a screen, but it is also a projection of the disaster ahead of the event itself taking place. To return to the film's plot, despite being one of the few openly negative residents, Jae-hyuk is the one who ultimately sacrifices himself to save the nation. He can be seen pictured here. Considering the plot as a whole, Pandora is in many ways a typical sensationalist disaster film, exaggerating or ignoring the hard science of meltdowns and focusing overmuch on simplistic versions of human emotions while also succumbing to hero worship. However, The macro concerns of how safe nuclear power is for humanity, the likelihood of a disaster based on geological and ecological trends, and the fear of government mismanagement are realistic in their portrayal. Outside of the filmic context, the reality of the 3/11 disaster being close to home did influence the way nuclear power was being managed in Korea. For example, after 3/11, the Korean government began to take actions to inspect their own nuclear power plants. During this process, it came to light that there were many nuclear plants in Korea that were faking equipment safety tests, and that the country had almost run out of space to dispose of high-level radioactive waste. If nuclear power was a minor part of Korea's overall energy infrastructure, perhaps these oversights would have been less concerning. However, of countries with more than 10 plants total, Korea has the world's highest density of nuclear power plants, and these plants are primarily located on the eastern coast of the peninsula. As pictured here, you can see the plants and the density of their location on the east coast. The concentrated density of the plants is not surprising given Korea's history of industrial development, specifically in the East Coast area, but the geographical location is worth pointing out here because the two largest earthquakes in Korea's history occurred in 2016 and 2017, and both were on the eastern side near the power plants, as can be seen pictured here with the red dots where the largest earthquakes have occurred. These facts alone are enough to begin painting a monstrous picture of the situation: poorly upkept plants, overcrowded locations, and earthquakes increasing in frequency and strength. Unfortunately, these issues do not exist in a vacuum, and the political and economic situations must also be contended with. In May 2017, Moon Jae-in, pictured here in the middle, became president, and part of his platform that gained him support was his promise to phase out nuclear power and increase renewables in Korea to 20% by 2030. However, in October 2017, the government approved continued construction of new nuclear power plants, including in Ulsan, where Pandora is set, despite the recent earthquakes and lingering shadow of 3/11. Since there have not been major disasters caused by nuclear power plants in Korea, it's easy to imagine how the government can justify the continued plant construction, and when weighing profits against the future of nuclear impacts on the Korean peninsula, the balance has continued to weigh in favor of the nuclear industry. In Pandora, the sentiment that the government is putting profit before people is shown in the portrayal of the energy industry officials' reactions to the meltdown itself. After the earthquake occurs, the film cuts to the power plant control room, as can be seen pictured here. A worker informs the main engineer that the earthquake has caused a crack in the cooling system in one of the reactors, as previously stated, a direct mirroring of the real situation in Fukushima. The plant managers, who have little to no knowledge of the mechanical workings of the reactor themselves, try to downplay the situation, but the superintendent informs them that the reactor affected is over 40 years old and has never been properly repaired due to the constant budget restraints put on them by the higher-ups. Despite this, the managers refuse to declare a state of emergency until it has been cleared with both the president's office and the heads of the energy company. After the plant managers deny the pleas for an emergency to be declared, the scene cuts to a worker reporting the issue to one of the power company overseers, who is at that very moment approving the construction of a new nuclear power plant. The overseer again denies the right to declare an emergency, instead pointing out that the company will lose profit if they shut down the plant, and tells the worker to handle the issue quietly instead. These scenes create a projection of a nuclear plant disaster based not only on the current dangers of the nuclear power plant situation in Korea, but also based on the mismanagement of the 3/11 disaster in Japan. Scholars have specifically noted that insufficient acknowledgement of tectonic risk despite geological information, overall lack of knowledge among government officials about nuclear disaster management, and poor communication between parties due to the bureaucracy during the disaster all contributed to a worsening of the situation during 3/11. Pandora reproduces these same issues, but in a Korean context. Tectonic activity is increasing around the Korean peninsula. Enforcement of safety in the power plants is inconsistent, and the Korean people have seen other disasters mishandled by presidents, such as this Haewol Ferry incident. The portrayal of incompetent authority figures in Pandora becomes a generalizable archetype, suggesting a continued narrative of if it can happen to them, it can happen to us, between Japan's disaster preparedness and Korea's. as can be seen here, the officials being unable to come to a decision about calling an emergency. The closeness yet farness of Japan, both in location and cultural overlap, makes the potential situation of nuclear power plant disaster an uncanny one because it is both familiar yet unfamiliar. The ties Pandora makes to Japan posit disaster as a part of the general consciousness of Korea, and yet, because such a disaster has not actually happened in Korea, seeing the situation reflected visually on the Korean peninsula contains a horrific element of the forbidden being revealed. The idea of something that is hidden becoming visible is a key element of projection as Freud discussed the concept in his works. There are things that are inaccessible to the consciousness except via projection, which must be processed by throwing them in front of oneself, literally or figuratively speaking, and only then do they become acknowledgeable. Making the unacknowledged acknowledgeable is apt to Pandora because we see so many characters in the plot avoiding a conversation about the negatives of relying on a nuclear power plant. For example, there is a scene in Pandora in which the plant workers are being driven to work in a company bus, but their trip is delayed by anti-nuclear protesters blocking the road. After waiting and listening to the protesters chanting, one of the workers exits the bus to confront them. However, the two men are unable to see eye to eye on the dangers that the plant presents, as can be seen here, the two of them arguing. The lead protester insists that if the plant isn't closed soon, quote, "we're all going to die," end quote. But the plant worker just exasperatedly responds, quote, "you've been saying that for years," end quote. The physical impasse of the protesters' bodies and the bus mirror the impasse of temporal reasoning on the two sides. Although the protesters are able to acknowledge disastrous temporality, the plant worker is not. The worker either does not think about the possibility of disaster, or more likely, when it crosses his mind, he reacts with repressive indifference that allows him to continue his job without going insane. The usual human reaction to instinctual danger, which is in this case the fear of nuclear disaster, is repression, or in other words, avoidance. And likewise, the people working in the plant or living next to it in Pandora must repress great levels of instinctual danger every day. According to Freud, it is projection that can allow these fears to be seen and therefore confronted. What gets projected is the cause or source of the anxiety, which in the case of Pandora is a nuclear meltdown and the very real possibility of it occurring, as can be seen here, a visual projection of what a power plant meltdown would look like from Pandora. The imagery and plot of the film make visible the repressed relationality between Korea and Japan and subvert borders of space and time to emphasize the uncanny similarity of 311's geological and political conditions to those in contemporary Korea. The projection of the disaster in Pandora exemplifies the impossibility of a disasterless future because the plant in the film, and all the real nuclear power plants in Korea, exist in a world where 311 exists. Given this, the protester in the film is not only correct about the trajectory of the film's plot, but also about Korea's nuclear futurity. Just because a disaster hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it won't. In conclusion, while Pandora may not be aggressively anti-nuclear in its overall message, it is aggressively critical of the human mismanagement of nuclear power, and by using projection, it offers Korea a preview of what not to do when the disaster comes. Thank you all for listening. Have a good day.